an election law expert as well, Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, how are you, my friend?
Mark, I'm doing great.
Hans is Senior Legal Fellow of the Heritage Foundation. Before that, he was a commissioner for the Federal Election Commission. He was counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the National Department of Justice in charge of enforcing voting rights laws. Who better to have? Hans, hundreds of lawsuits were brought prior to this election, the vast majority of which were by the Democrat Party or Democrat Party surrogates.
Right.
Hundreds of them. Number one, have you ever seen anything like this before? And number two, what was the purpose of these lawsuits?
No, it was unprecedented. I've never seen so many lawsuits filed before Election Day, and all the lawsuits had a common theme. They all tried to get the security protocols that are in place for absentee or mail-in ballots eliminated. You know, they wanted to get rid of, for example, witness signature requirements on absentee ballots. They wanted to get rid of signature comparison for absentee ballots when election officials compare the signature on the ballot with the signature on file for the voter. They tried to implement vote harvesting in every state. So states that banned vote harvesting, in other words, strangers and being able to come to your front door to pick up ballots, they wanted that overridden. In Alabama, which has a voter ID law that applies to absentee ballots, they tried to get the courts to basically say they couldn't apply that ID law to absentee ballots either. So everything they did was intended to get rid of any of the protections and measures put in place by states to try to prevent fraud in the use of absentee ballots.
And they succeeded in many respects in states like Pennsylvania and other states, didn't they?
Yeah, they sure did. I mean, the order by the Pennsylvania court was really bizarre in many aspects, telling the election officials there that they couldn't reject a ballot if the signature didn't match. They couldn't reject a ballot even if there's no postmark on the envelope to indicate it's been voted by Election Day, and then extending the deadline past the deadline set by the state legislature.
Well, let's again take Pennsylvania as an example, although it's not the only example. If you're not required to have a postmark or a signature that matches another signature, in fact, you could have voted after Election Day, couldn't you?
You sure could, and it would be very easy if you can pick up absentee ballots that have not been voted by voters, which happens all the time, to submit fraudulent ballots.
Yeah, because no signature is required. So what are they going to check it against? Now, under those circumstances, it's interesting. In-person voting has an absolute deadline. You better be at your precinct in Pennsylvania by 8 p.m. Eastern time in the line, or you don't get the vote. So all of these were Trump voters. On the other hand, if you're sitting at home, maybe you're watching the election results, you don't like what's happening in Pennsylvania, the early vote, you can vote your mail-in vote. You don't have to have a postal date on there. In fact, you don't want one. You don't have to sign it. You drop it off, and the vote counts. Correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that is very problematic. Look, there's no reason to extend the deadline for absentee ballots past Election Day. It's not as if absentee ballots, you can only get them a couple of days before Election Day. In fact, the vast majority of them can be requested and obtained weeks, if not more than a month, 2 months before Election Day. So you have plenty of time to get it back in the hands of election officials by the end of Election Day.
You know, I brought this up to Judge Starr. I brought it up on my radio show. I've written about this now. The Democrats want to, they want an earlier and earlier vote, and a later and later count. An earlier vote and a later count. Why?
Well, the earlier you vote, frankly, the less information you have about candidates. I mean, look, some states were starting early voting before the first presidential debate even occurred. And what that meant was that if individuals changed their mind because of information they got after they'd already voted, guess what? It's too late. It's too late to change your ballot. And by counting ballots late, it gives, unfortunately, the opportunity particularly for absentee ballots, to try to gather up ballots that had not been voted after Election Day, which is another reason they wanted vote harvesting everywhere. So vote harvesters can go through neighborhoods, collect absentee ballots that haven't been voted, and then use that to try to change the results of the election, which they already know how it's going from the preliminary count.
Isn't another reason to have votes earlier and earlier to really incentivize people not to vote in person, where we have more and more structures in place? We have election judges, we have both parties. Your name is matched against a registration. In many states, you have voter ID. You vote early, you vote mail-in. You don't need a signature. You don't need a postal date. Whatever a state does, whatever the boards of elections do in violation of the federal Constitution when the state legislature is trying to set in safeguards, then you have anarchy in many of these situations. You have chaos, don't you?
Yeah, and look, one of the most important ingredients of a fair and secure election is transparency. That's why every state authorizes poll watchers from the candidates and the political parties to not only be in polling stations, but supposedly also where they're counting the ballots. Well, you can't have that when people are voting through the mail. They're voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And look, nobody disputes that you need absentee ballots for people who are too sick or too disabled to make it to the polls, or who are going to be out of town on election day like our overseas military folks. But for the vast majority of us, we should vote in person, and you shouldn't vote by absentee ballot. I mean, that's just not the smart thing to do.